This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to another edition of Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with the inimitable John Stonestreet to talk about the headlines and stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And we are coming up on this fine Mother's Day weekend. And if you were too distracted during quarantine to remember that Mother's Day is almost upon us, you're welcome. You have about 24 hours now. The clock starts now. Go.
I think Walgreens always has last-minute flowers and candy. And I think, by the way, most stores have leftover Valentine's candy, so you can just repurpose.
Yes.
Yeah,
because they haven't been open since Valentine's Day, basically.
Yeah, you know, it feels like an odd place where a lot of America wants to open up. There's an awful lot of growing pains in that whole process. Even our producer, Steve Ryder, his wife's been in the hospital, and he has been on local media here in Colorado Springs talking about some of that. I don't want to undersell it by calling it, you know, growing pains or, you know, transition pains, because for him it's tragic. But you've got old regulations with new realities, and you've got new data coming in, and you've got just tons of stuff. You know, the governor of Illinois this week issued an edict basically saying that churches over 50 probably won't be able to open for another year.
Wow.
And then, of course, in your state of Florida, Shane, you know, NBA teams are going back to practice. So, right. I mean, there's just no consistency right now. And we've all reached that time, even though we're, you know, doing this as we're looking at each other through Zoom, where if I don't get on another Zoom call for the rest of my life, it still might be too soon.
We're all getting sick of it. And we are reaching, I saw a story in ABC this week that said, you know, there's studies that have established historically in, you know, submarines and Arctic base camps and the space station that there's this thing called third quarter fatigue that sets in when people are in isolation or cooped up with each other. And the duration of the time is not what matters so much as, according to the article, the expectation of the time. So once you begin hitting that third quarter, you're like, well, the end is coming, but then it doesn't. Or it gets dragged on indefinitely, as it is in certain states, and people start turning on each other. People start losing their grace with each other. Yeah,
that's right. We saw that in California because California's numbers have been, you know, relatively good, and Gavin Newsom has just kind of proved to be unpredictable. And I think that's the case in Illinois, because basically when I said that the Illinois governor said that the churches over 50 wouldn't be able to reopen for a year, what he meant was it wouldn't be able to reopen until there's a vaccine in place. Ooh. And that's not the criteria that has been used at any point up until now, flattening the curve.
Bait and switch.
No, it is. And I think that's what people are feeling, that things keep moving. And the goalposts, as people are saying, keep moving. And that makes it really, really hard. I think there's some things we can learn from history. I mean, you mentioned, you know, some of these times past. I just finished watching, and in our tradition here of recommending things, if you're out of things on Netflix and Hulu and so on, we did a big push this week on The Chosen, which I'm now done with. So come on, folks, let's get season 2. I think you've got the actor who plays Jesus coming up on the podcast, right?
Yeah.
That'll
I'm going to have
fun.
Jesus on the Breakpoint podcast. I'm sorry.
To...
That was probably a little bit sacrilegious, but I'm going to have the actor.
How do you say that? Yeah, the actor.
We're going to have the actor who plays Jesus on the podcast to talk about the series. So it's going to be really exciting.
That's going to be really cool. But this kind of third quarter fatigue thing, I think we can go back and learn from one of the most remarkable exploration stories in history. It's the story of Ernest Shackleton and his journey to cross. And I just watched a wonderful thing on, I think it was Amazon Prime has this, which is his first captain, who's the one who essentially, you know, achieved these remarkable navigational things in the toughest seas in the world, while the lifeboat that was turned into a ship gets, you know, covered with ice, and he gets 3 readings from the sun and 2 weeks, and he still nails this little island. And if you don't know anything about the Shackleton story, it's actually remarkable, and there's a lot of really good stuff. Maybe that's a good way to get over third quarter fatigue, which is a good phrase. I hadn't heard that phrase before, so I'm grateful to have that.
Yeah, we just compare ourselves to Arctic explorers and submariners and all the other people who have had to endure much worse than we're having to endure right now, sitting on our couches in front of Netflix.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, that said, there was a story that we need to begin with this week, which is not one we want to take lightly at all. A video emerged this week of an incident that happened, and this is probably the thing that I think most people are struggling with. From February the 23rd, of a young African-American man jogging in a neighborhood in South Georgia. Two white men in trucks, attempt to stop him. And you talk about moving goalposts somewhere between questioning and a citizen's arrest, which aren't the same thing at all.
Right.
And, the end of the story is this young man gets shot with a shotgun twice in the chest. The video is so hard to watch. I'm not recommending people watch it, but it is the thing that pushed, I think, the case over the edge and showed the initial prosecutors, his take on it, which led to the non-arrest just being kind of bogus. David French did a terrific, I think, analysis of this on a legal perspective this week, which we'll link to on the show notes. But the last word of the week is these two men have now been arrested.
Yeah, I think late yesterday we got word that they had been arrested and charged with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. So we'll see what comes out of this. But of course, the unspoken fact that it's dominating headlines here, and the reason why this is such a big deal is because these are two white men in South Georgia. This is a black man out jogging, and the video definitely backs up his side of things. I mean, he's out there in his jogging shorts, and he's just going on along at a leisurely pace. These guys apparently, by their own testimony even, they see him going by, they think he's the burglar who's been, hitting houses recently in their neighborhood, and then they just follow him, box him in with their truck, and a second later he starts to apparently try to defend himself, and then he's dead. So it's another entry in that sort of, racist Black Lives Matter kind of arena, but it's also a police brutality issue because the father, at least in this case, as far as I understand, is a retired police officer. And so that's also one of the reasons why the members of his department locally had to recuse themselves from the case because they were, so involved with him.
Yeah, I mean, this one's just so ugly from the start to the finish, and you kind of wait. The wise thing often to do is to wait because details emerge, and the problem in this case is that this is the detail that has emerged, is this video, and the waiting has been taking place since February the 23rd. And you want to just kind of look at it and go, okay, is there something else that's going to emerge in this story? Is there another detail? Is there another part of the video that we haven't seen? Is there something that happened 10 minutes before this that we haven't seen? And none of that's in the recorded testimony. None of that's in the 911 call. It's hard to imagine anything that's going to make this any less horrific and more justified. It seems like an act of vigilante sort of quote-unquote attempts at justice, and it's just awful, and it's just the mess of this. Now, the other question is, because it involves, two white men and a black man, it's being put into that kind of narrative, and, the sort of vigilante justice this guys were kind of about, hop in a truck, let's go take care of things, make sure you arm yourself. I mean, these aren't the ideas of rational people, particularly, by the way, Shane, I think those who had been involved in law enforcement in the past, like the dad in this story, one of the two men had been. So would this same thing would have unfolded, and this is what you have to unravel this on the racial side of things, what is Ahmaud Arbery a mistaken identity? Is this case a mistaken identity where they, believe that someone had been robbing, local construction sites and, and that sort of stuff? Is he that guy that did that? Is he not that guy that did that? Would the same mistake had been made if we're talking about a white man on the security camera instead of a black man? There's still a million questions here that are going to get to the bottom of the racial side of this. But it's going to be seen this way. And one of the reasons it's going to be seen this way is that the immediate justification, it's impossible right now to see the immediate justification, the inability or the unwillingness to arrest these two guys, even bring them in, as anything more than a good old boys network in South Georgia. And, look, we don't get to have our events, our incidents, in a vacuum. They're part of a history. They're part of a story. And this one's part of a national story, and it's part of a Georgia story.
Yeah, and it forces us to reckon with certain things, John. I mean, we're not a court of law here. We're not adjudicating this case. And I thank God that we have a system in which people get a fair trial, where, they get to stand before their peers and hear the evidence and make a determination. And sometimes in those cases, the facts don't back up what the initial media story was. And that could be the case here. But as far as I can see, like you said, it looks really bad for these two guys. And, racism isn't the only issue at play here, John. And though I think that, unlike a Black Lives Matter crowd would say, I don't think it's as much of a pervasive issue as they say, but I also don't think it's as extinct as a lot of conservatives might want to say, a lot of those on the right.
Yeah,
I think racism still exists in this country.
I want to be really careful on this because the conservative voices calling for justice on this one after seeing this video were as loud as the liberal ones, with the exception of the alt-right folks on media or those that immediately make this a political issue. So I want to be really careful about this. But you just brought up something, Shane, that I think is really important to remember. And this is an important part when we're talking about things like discrimination and bias, racism, things like that, that those that have the complaints on these sorts of issues often have these complaints on structural levels. And those that are the defendants, so to speak, are the ones that often see this in terms of individualistic ones, right? So right now you have individuals that are trying to make sense of this, and white America is much more likely to say, well, I'm not a racist. I don't know anybody that's a racist. And there's, you can justify away individual motivations, including in a horrific, awful action like this.
Yeah.
Those on the other side, and I think probably the best analysis I heard of this was from a Christian theologian, Carl Ellis, who said, those in the majority party tend to see it as individualistic. Those in the minority tend to see it in terms of structural. And so, for example, I think about it this way. I know that Christians, for example, talking about the secularism of culture, those in power, the secularists over schools and that sort of stuff, will see this on an individualistic level. They'll say, well, if a kid wants to bring his Bible to school, he can. If he wants to pray quietly at his desk before a test, he can. Those of us in the minority are looking at this and talking about the structural thing. Look at these Supreme Court decisions that have taken prayer out of public schools, and look at these Supreme Court cases, and look at da-da-da-da. Does that make sense? It's this individualistic versus, and making that choice is almost always the wrong choice. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Evil is systemic and evil is individual. Evil is systemic, but not in the sense biblically that it alleviates or eliminates personal guilt. And personal guilt doesn't eliminate the fact that evil creeps into things. I think we have the sense that, right, like there's this glass of water and there's a drop, there's a rock in there, and that's what sin is, and we want to pull that rock out and then everything will be good again. So I'm not a racist. This is
going to be the poop metaphor, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Okay.
But what sin does, and this is what I think we see in Scripture, is it's much more like a drop of dye or a drop of ink. It just...
Okay. I heard something else.
Yeah, no. But follow me on this. You can't just pull that drop of ink back out.
Right.
Look, the racial history of America, the injustice that was done, the evil that was done, oftentimes, intentionally separating families, intentionally disenfranchising individuals, treating them as less than image of God. These aren't just evils. These are grave evils. And to think that we can wake up one day and not have this whole history and suddenly everything should be fine and those should get over, it's not the right understanding of sin. And it's not the right understanding of this sin in particular.
Has generational consequences. And
Absolutely.
And it's very tempting as a conservative, to look at that history of racial injustice and say, well, the real problem with the black community, for instance, is the breakdown of the family. Well, okay, we can grant that on a certain sense, but, if you look back in the history of this country, segregation, Jim Crow, slavery, those are not pro-family policies. Those are the most anti-family policies imaginable. And that's what, historically broke down the black family. So we have all these issues that we do have to grapple with as Christians. And I think, John, my mind goes back to a moment, when I was a young teenager. And I didn't get this sort of stuff because I lived out of my experience. I thought what you just said, that I'd never been racist and I didn't know anybody who was racist. So I thought, well, there must not be racism out there. And my parents and I were driving down the street after a church event, and my dad saw a friend of his walking on the sidewalk there, and along with his wife, and he's black. And he rolls down the window and, kind of shouts to him, "Hey, how you doing?" And I'll never forget the way this guy jumped in front of his wife to shield her, as if, he's in fear for their lives at that point. And I realized right then that there's something he's experienced or he's been told about. He knows someone who's experienced that has planted that seed of fear in his mind. He has a real rational basis for living in a kind of fear that I don't understand.
Yeah.
And so that is, that's part of that alternate experience.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, there's a lot more to come out of this story, and none of this does anything to alleviate individual responsibility on any side. None of this are excuses for our own decisions that we make personally, whether, members of the African American community or members of the white community or anything like this. But probably the wake-up call for me, Shane, and kind of backing up and rethinking. And I hate that this gets put on the conservative side and liberal side, because this one makes no sense to be politically divided the way that it is. But at the same time, I remember when I first realized that, I knew that I disagreed with Jesse Jackson and Louis Farrakhan on almost everything. And so then I assumed,
Sharpton.
well, yeah, I disagree with them on this too. I mean, I disagreed on, economics and politics and theology. I mean, but when I realized that I'm seeing this different than brothers and sisters in Christ who I deeply respect as theologians, as thinkers, and I know that they're on the same, like we agree on the resurrection and inerrancy of Scripture, and even other conservative things that are non-theological, whether it's economic policy or whatever. When I listened to our former Colson Center board member, Chris Brooks, after some of the former incidents, talk about the conversations that he has with his son and that he has to have with his son, given the, this is what you do when you get pulled over, things like that. And listen, I'm not saying all cops are bad. We've got to figure out how to walk and chew gum at the same time. When I heard the sort of conversations he's having with his sons, and I realized I didn't even occur to me to have those conversations with my kids. And he and I agree on everything theologically, and almost, by the way, on everything else. At some point, our theological commitments have to, go beyond any other commitments. Look, these are hard. There's not an easy way forward on this. Again, it goes back to how we understand sin. Sin's not just something we can pull out of the glass. It's something that infects everything, and it affects how we see each other. And so God give us help on this one as we move forward.
Amen. God help us. Folks, we're up on a break right now. We'll be right back in just a moment to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet. There's another story this week, John, that I think was notable simply because of the way it was reported. There was a tone of general acceptance and celebration over the fact that CNN host Anderson Cooper has announced the birth of his first child. And of course, anyone who knows anything about Anderson Cooper knows that he is gay and he's in a same-sex relationship. So how did he have a child? Well, it was through surrogacy. It was through hiring a woman to basically donate her womb for a certain amount. Well, not donate, but it's more like selling her womb for a certain amount of time to, produce this child. And now the sort of adulation surrounding him, I think, betrays the way that surrogacy as a practice has just slipped into our culture unnoticed, even in some instances into the church when it comes to heterosexual couples. So let's talk about surrogacy. Let's talk about the issues surrounding that and why it's so unquestioningly accepted now.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to be clear on something. The only reason Anderson Cooper is part of the story is because he's a celebrity, and as a celebrity, having a child gets you a headline.
Right.
I mean, there's plenty of babies born from surrogacy that aren't on the headlines. But there's two things that are underneath this, and it reminded me of a situation years ago after two back-to-back award shows. The first one was the MTV Video Music Awards, when Miley Cyrus did something incredibly perverse and provocative on stage, and everyone was talking about it. And then a couple months later was the Grammys, in which there was the first gay wedding on television, and it was right after the California reversal of Prop 8 there. And it was actually 50 or 60 couples on stage, some heterosexual, some homosexual, getting married at the same time, like legitimately married, because California had just moved on that issue. And I remember remembering thinking that...
I remember the Oprah memes. You get a wedding. You get a wedding. Everyone gets a wedding.
Yeah, but what was interesting is that the noise and commotion around the Miley Cyrus thing was so much louder than the noise and commotion around the gay marriage. In other words, it almost happened as if it were expected. It was just one of those things. And that's what I saw in this story. No one was kind of talking about kind of the remarkable details, right? That a mom's relationship with her child will be governed by a contract with clauses and exceptions and not by biology. That a man who had made no biological contribution whatsoever would be called the father from here on out. Not on the birth certificate yet, although I don't know what California or wherever Anderson Cooper is, I don't know what the policy is there. I think that's a state-by-state thing, but mostly the birth mom is still listed. But they weren't talking about any of those kind of remarkable details. You never even heard the woman's name.
Right.
It was almost as if she really was basically a uterus and not really a full woman. because, you didn't need the whole woman part, including, the mother part, the biological and emotional connections that are part of that relationship. None of that was in the headlines. The headlines were kind of gushing over, isn't he a cute dad? Isn't he a cute kid? What are they going to name him? What's it like to have a baby? As if Anderson Cooper did in a time of, coronavirus. In other words, all the details of the surrogacy part were passed over as if there were nothing remarkable about them at all. And if you've read A Practical Guide to Culture, if you've heard us talk about these things, culture's most powerful in our lives, not where it's the loudest, but where things are presented as mundane and normal. And this was my concern, is that I've seen that same thing in the church. There's two groups of people that should be outraged by this. One are liberals who are against the exploitation, the progressive left who claim to be against the exploitation of women. And the other are Christians who claim that God created sex and marriage. And for both of these groups, it often is very, very quiet when it comes to surrogacy.
Yeah, like what are liberals historically against, John? They're against the exploitation of the poor by the rich, which is the way surrogacy happens. I mean, you're paying someone to give up 9 months of her life and then give up her maternal bond with a child in order to get some money.
And listen, let's be clear on this. On that point alone, and there's a bunch more which we'll get to, and which we talked about in Breakpoint, but on that point alone, nearly all of the world has criminalized commercial surrogacy and sometimes surrogacy in general. And in America, we're on the opposite trajectory where we're not only going to surrogacy, we're going to, it's almost like this is already decided that there's no ethical considerations of surrogacy, and all that's left are the contract negotiations.
I think it was Rod Dreher who wrote an article a while back talking about how sexual freedom is now the only freedom in our society, because when it comes in conflict with other freedoms, it always trumps them. Now, there are exceptions to this, like where you have a Jack Phillips and ADF takes it to the Supreme Court and battles it all the way up there, and then sometimes you get an encouraging victory. But by and large, culturally speaking, the instinct is to affirm the sexual rights and then squash all the other rights. And in this case, the rights being squashed are the rights of a child to its mother, foremost, the rights of of a woman to be treated as a human being and not as a sort of disparate collection of organs and abilities. And I love what you said earlier, John. It's such an unintentionally shrewd natural law argument, or maybe it was intentional. I'm not giving you enough credit, but the idea that you can take a person and pull them into pieces figuratively and sort of just take this function but not that function, that you can take sexual pleasure from a person but not take the person or the offspring or the commitment it takes to love that individual. We call that prostitution. Well, the same kind of mindset is going on here with surrogacy, that you can pay a person for her reproductive capacity and then just sort of discard her, not only from your life, but from the life of her child. But there are ineffable bonds that are formed when a child is gestating in its mother's womb. That child knows the mother's voice. When the child is born, he or she knows the mother's smell. I mean, this is what you're ripping away from that person, to say nothing of the intrinsic need for a mother as you grow up, is devastating. All for what? All for the effort to fulfill the sexual desires of adults who have entered into, by the way, an intrinsically sterile relationship with no womb involved.
Yeah, so you just brought up 2-3 things that are huge, and I just want to highlight them for everyone. That one of the other undercurrents of this story is that right now surrogacy and the legalization of commercial surrogacy in particular is being pushed out of the gay community, out of gay leaders, out of gay legislators. This is what's true in both Washington State and New York, where we have this. So here's individuals like Anderson Cooper who've chosen a union that's sterile. And it's not sterile because of a disability or because of a tragedy. It's intentionally sterile.
Because they're both dudes.
Because it's a sterile union, and now demanding children on the backside. Second, you said to say nothing of the inherent need of a child for a mom. Listen, this is what science and research has been absolutely clear on from the very beginning. That children universally do best on average when they're in a home with biological mom and dad. And a lot of times when a child's not in a home with biological mom and dad, it's because we've recognized something's gone wrong and we've brought in a solution, adoption, and that sort of thing.
And adoption, by the way, we have to mention, it recognizes an existing form of brokenness that was not created in order to bring that adoption about. And then it brings redemption, whereas surrogacy creates new brokenness.
This is intentional. That's the difference. And this is why people have to see the difference. This is intentionally robbing a child of a biological bond with a mom and a dad. And by the way, research is clear not only that children do best in home homes with biological moms and dads, but that moms and dads parent differently. I know this is a good point for Mother's Day. Dads don't mom, and moms don't dad.
There's no such thing as a parent. Was that Ben Shapiro?
I think I've heard it from Ryan Anderson and a couple others. But yeah, there's
Very good. That's Ryan Anderson. You're right.
Yeah, there's only mommying and daddying. And listen, this is something that oftentimes when I say it to audiences, people are like, "Duh." Like, of course, moms, put the kids, in playtime with, organized activities and, hand wipes ready to go, and dads are tossing kids in the air, right? They do it differently. But we've actually seen that there's emotional and developmental benefits on both sides of this. Now, the reason I bring this up is because people realize that intuitively, but they don't make the next intuitive connection, which is that, especially in the case of gay-driven surrogacy and legalization there, not only do you have the risk of exploitation of women, but you actually are intentionally robbing a child of a mom or a dad, in this case a mom. The other thing I want to say too that you brought up needs to be highlighted again and again and again and again is going back to the progressive causes of the left. You listed a bunch of them, but isn't the most dominant progressive talking point when it comes to women, my body, my choice, my body, my choice, my body, my choice, and that laws should not govern that? If there's any violation of that on the planet, it's surrogacy, because a woman doesn't have a choice. She is bound by the contract. So in other words, because of a contract, if there's a fetal abnormality, she wants to keep the baby, the hired family does not.
And by the way, that's not a fantasy. That's something that has happened. There have been stories of a woman changing her mind after the fact and either wanting to keep the baby or wanting not to follow through on the terms of the contract to abort the baby because of some abnormality or something. And that's had to go to court. Now, so far as I know, no judge has yet enforced the contract, but it's only a matter of time if we keep going down this road.
Oh, I think they have enforced the contract. I have to go back to legal history, but you're right. I mean, but in terms of if we wanted a boy, went through in vitro fertilization and all that sort of stuff to determine what's a boy, you gave us a girl, we don't want this child now, all of that stuff. Now, it may not be in U.S. contract law, Shane, absolutely been the case with what's called reproductive tourism, in which Westerners go to impoverished countries that don't have these laws. And that's the sort of exploitation that we see all over the place. But here's the problem. I mean, we just listed in the last few minutes a ridiculous amount of ethical questions. And here you have a headline. And I don't want to pick on Anderson Cooper. He seems like a decent guy. I'm not picking on him or any of this. What I'm saying is,
nor are we saying that this child is not, a precious gift from God,
absolutely,
and made in the image of God.
Absolutely. But we've just brought up not only a handful of ethical challenges, a handful of incredibly difficult, devious ethical challenges.
Yeah.
And all of those get passed over in a headline for, I wonder if he likes being a new dad. This is a sign of the times. You have to watch for the things that are assumed, as C.S. Lewis said, not just the things that are blatantly argued.
What was it Dalrymple who wrote about the toxic cult of sentimentality and how one of the problems with it is that sentimentality, like we see in this headline and the reporting around it, causes us to gloss over real moral issues, real ethical questions, because it's portrayed as nice and fluffy and happy, and this is beautiful. But it's not if you actually look into the questions of what's happening.
Hey, this is a really important point you're bringing up, Shane, and this is why we're doing the Truth Love Together virtual event the way that we are. And one of the most important components of this online virtual event, which you can sign up for at wilberforceweekend.com or come to the show notes here and we'll point you to it, is the second module, which is trying to define love. And the point that I make in my first talk is precisely that one, that almost every time we hear the word love used in our culture, it is a substitute for either a sensuality or a sentimentality. Love has been defined down, dumbed down, reduced down to one of those two things. We never see the word love used in any sort of kind of radical agape or the strong brotherly love. It's sentimentality or it's sensuality. And this is what we saw in this story. So we would say, well, Christians should be loving, so we should respect Anderson Cooper's choices. That is the worst definition of love. It's a sentimentality. Shouldn't we love the child? Shouldn't we love Anderson Cooper enough to say that violating observable biological norms is wrong? As if you can love without the truth? And so that's why we did this event the way that we did, and we'd love for people to sign up. We got a remarkable group of people that have signed up to be a part of this virtual event. I think we're pushing over 4,000 or 5,000 people right now that are going to join us for this. So again, come to breakpoint.org to the show notes, and we'll tell you how to get that.
Amen. That's a great place to wrap it up. I do want to say before we close, John, that the resource par excellence on this, and the thing that I think you'll probably be recommending in your talk, is C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves, where he goes through the New Testament concepts of love, the 4 Greek words that denote different kinds of love, and how they shape our entire lives, and how confusing all those loves with each other can have devastating results.
You read my mind. I recommend that book more than anything else. And you know what's interesting is none of the 4 loves that Lewis describes are in parlance today. It's not just that we've forgotten 2 of them or 3 of them. It's that we don't have any of them, and instead we have sentimentality and sexuality. And eros is not the same thing as porneo, and we need to cut this show off.
Amen. Well, folks, thanks so much for listening. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all the resources we mentioned on today's program. For John Stonestreet, I'm Shane Morris, signing off for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Thanks for listening.